It's time to make a return to the world of PC gaming on Android, but this time around we'll be focusing in on Gamehub, and for the first time ever on the channel, a dedicated video to the topic. In the past, I've covered Winlator, which also allows us to achieve the same goal, but Gamehub does make things a bit easier, and even at times can play games that otherwise won't work elsewhere. This is going to be a video that I hope has something of interest for many, as we will not only cover the setup and install of Gamehub, but we will be looking at 4 different chipsets that power our favorite handhelds and devices, with the Snapdragon 865, G2 Gen 2, 8 Gen 2, and the 8 Elite in a comparison showcase, and then cap it all off with settings that work best for the games featured in the showcase. So please join me, Rob the Retro Tech Dad, as we dive into all things Gamehub. Okay, so before we begin, let's go over the goals of this video, and there are a few things that I want to accomplish with this. Now, the first thing we're going to do is just quickly go over the install and setup of Gamehub, and I will be using just the standard version of Gamehub, which at the time of publishing this video will be Gamehub version 5.3.5, and much of this will also apply to Gamehub Lite as well. We will also go over the default settings that I typically start out with for any device that I work with when I'm using Gamehub. And as always, I will have timestamps for everything so you can skip around as you need to. The next thing we're going to be doing here is just going to have some fun and do a bit of a comparison showcase, and for this video we'll be looking at the Snapdragon 865 that is found in many handhelds including the Retroid Pocket 5, Flip 2, Mini, and the upcoming Mangmi Air Max, as well as the fairly new Retroid Pocket G2, which has the Snapdragon G2 Gen 2, and then the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, which is currently in handhelds like the Odin 2, Odin 2 Mini, and the Odin 2 Portal, as well as the upcoming Retroid Pocket 6. Finally, we will also have the Snapdragon 8 Elite, which is currently found in the Odin 3, and at some point the KONKR Pocket Fit. The best part is that all of this should work on various phones and tablets that support all of these chipsets. I originally started this video before the Odin 3 released, and so it was actually never meant to include the Odin 3 and 8 Elite, but I decided to go back and add that as another comparison point, since I do think it's very useful and I do want to showcase games that run very well with the 8 Elite chipset. Which leads me to the last goal of this video, and that's to include everyone in on the fun, and so regardless if you're on a Retroid Pocket 5 or rocking the latest Odin 3, I want to help you get at least the games featured in this showcase running as best as we can, and you will be surprised to find out that most of these games will work across the board, which is awesome, since at the end of the day, at least for me, it's always about having access to as many games as possible. So after each of the comparison segments, I will have settings as needed for each of the chipsets for each of the games, and so this video will cover a lot of different handhelds and hopefully be useful to many. Okay, so let's head on over to the Gamehub website and download the latest version, which can be done directly on your handheld, and I will have a link to the website to make things easier. The latest version again should be 5.3.5. Gamehub is also available on the Play Store, but if you want to access your micro SD card, you will need to get this version off their website. And given that we have some delisted games in this showcase, you probably want that micro SD access, but as always, use your own discretion. I am just showcasing what I've used and what I've done for myself. Alternatively, you can download Gamehub Lite, which I will also have linked in the description, but just keep in mind that I've occasionally had different results than what I've experienced in the standard Gamehub, as well as better download speeds when downloading Steam versions of games. Okay, back to the Gamehub website, and there's not a whole lot here, but just click on the Android download button to download the latest version, and you will get a warning that the file might be harmful, which Chrome always does. Just tap on download anyway. It shouldn't take too long, and once done, just tap on open and you might get a warning from Chrome that you can't install unknown apps from within Chrome. So tap on settings and then toggle on the allow from this source option. And once done, the pop-up to install will appear, and then tap on install to proceed, and then finally tap on open when it's done. The first thing you will get is a prompt to agree to their user agreement and privacy policy. Again, like many things, use your own discretion. Let's tap on agree, and now we are on the welcome to Gamehub screen, and you do need to log in either using your Google or Apple ID, or just create an account with your email, and you can totally use a burner email if you prefer here. I'm just going to go ahead and log in with Google. Now this step is not required if you're using Gamehub Lite. Finally, we get one last message to allow message notifications, and I usually just hit cancel to skip that. We are now on the main screen of Gamehub, and there's a lot of pretty icons and whatnot, but let's focus on the tabs up top, and if you scroll from the Discover tab to the left, you will get the library options. And here's where the magic happens. Now for this video, I take two different approaches to importing my games, which is either just downloading them through Steam, or in the case of some of the delisted games, I will import the full installation of the game so that I can point Gamehub to the exe file. So let's first go over connecting Steam to Gamehub, which is a very straightforward process, and all you need to do is select the Steam icon and then the sign into Steam option. On this screen, you can either sign in using your username and password, but I've actually never used this method and I only use the QR code option, which requires you to use the Steam mobile app, and it's a very simple process that has you scan the QR code, and then from there you're signed into your Steam account and can have access to your library. The QR code method is definitely more secure if you're concerned about any security. After you've connected your Steam account, it should look a bit like this, and you can see I have my Steam account listed here, and Gamehub is a bit, janky when it comes to all this. I have found the best method is to just use the search function to find the game that you want to install, and then go from there, as the navigation leaves a lot to be desired. So if you press Y, you can search your Steam library, and I'll go ahead and track down Castlevania Lords of Shadow, since it is a game that will be featured in this showcase. So now we're on the game screen for Castlevania Lords of Shadow, and if you select Get Game, you should get a pop-up window that gives you an install option. Now remember how I said Gamehub is a bit janky? This process can be janky, but it is working a lot better now than it has in the past. So as a tip, just wait for it to display the install size of the game before even bothering to select install. But once it does, which you can see Castlevania requires almost 15 gigs, tap install and then you will get a prompt to keep your screen on so it can download. And yes, it's important to make sure your device is on and not in standby for less issues. Okay, so it's now downloading, which you can see the progress bar on this screen. Additionally, there is a download section where you can see your active downloads and past downloads. You can quickly access it by tapping on the icon that is to the left of the Wi-Fi icon in the top right corner. Alright, so while that does its thing, let's talk about importing your own PC games that have been extracted or installed already somewhere else. And this is where that import feature comes in handy, especially when you have games loaded up on your micro SD card like I do. Back on the library page, let's go ahead and import our own game, and you can do this in various ways, but if you scroll over to the Windows icon, you can choose the Import PC Games option, or you can scroll all the way to the last icon on the right, and that will also allow you to import your PC games. The first time you attempt this, you will get a window that requires you to allow Gamehub access to manage all files, which is not in the Play Store version. So I will toggle this on, and now we can access the internal storage as well as the micro SD card that I have on my Odin 2 here. From here it's pretty straightforward, but I do keep offline and fully installed copies of a lot of my Steam games so that I can import them easily into Gamehub as needed. Let's use Blur as an example, which is a delisted game, and so you can't purchase this anymore on Steam, but it is pretty readily available as abandonware, and places like myabandonware.com will have it available. Just make sure to go with the pre-installed version, which is definitely easier to deal with. So if I go into my Blur folder, you can see the blur.exe file, which is what we want to point Gamehub to. The same goes for pretty much any game you are importing. Just point it to the game's exe and then go from there. So I'll go ahead and select the blur.exe, and now we have another window, and anytime you see this, just make sure that at least the name is populated before hitting confirm. Now Gamehub should automatically populate this, so you don't actually need to do anything here. Okay, so with our first game imported, let's talk about my default settings, and hopefully I'll be able to give some tips along the way. For Blur, if you go down to where it says View Details and then select the three dots to the right of it, we have a few more options that we can select. The single most important thing you can do here with Gamehub is to adjust the PC game settings, which is where all of the magic happens. Let's go ahead and select that option, and now we have a new window with quite a lot going on here. But for this video, we're going to keep it a bit more concise and just talk about the key things that need to be adjusted, and then we can go from there. So in the general section, the most important thing, at least in terms of this video, is the ability to adjust the resolution of your container. Now, if you're using a device with a Snapdragon 865, you're probably going to want to leave it at the default of 1280 by 720 as a minimum. For those that are on a bit more powerful devices like the 8 Gen 2 or 8 Elite, go ahead and bump it up to 1920 by 1080. What this does is allows us to change the resolution to as much as 1080p when we are in game. So for example, if this is only set to 720p, then we will not be able to go beyond that when we're actually in game. So if you scroll down a little bit, there is the command line option, and there will be some cases when we will need to make use of this, and I will let you know throughout the game's showcase if it's needed. For example, we can use this to instruct Gamehub to launch a game in DirectX11 mode, which can be a big difference in terms of compatibility or performance for certain games. So let's now select the compatibility option on the left, and this is easily the section you will want to pay the most attention to when it comes to adjusting things to potentially get a game to work. Now we will go over what I consider to be my default settings, which is basically what I start out with for every game, and then I work backwards trying to troubleshoot. It also helps make things a bit easier for you since most games will just work with these settings, and again I will let you know if anything needs to be adjusted during the showcase. Now I don't want you to be intimidated by everything here, so we're going to start out one by one. For the compatibility layer, the default option is Proton 10.0-ARM64X-2, which is a good starting point. You can see that we have a lot of different compatibility layers, and so it's easy to get lost here, but let's leave it at the default for now. The next option is the translation parameters, and there are a few presets that can make a big difference in terms of getting games to work, prevent them from crashing, or even getting a significant performance boost. As such, I like to scroll all the way to the left and select the extreme option, which in many cases gives games a very nice performance boost. Now unfortunately it can come at the cost of stability, and so you can work backwards with it and then try out the performance preset next and continue on from there. For the default settings, I am using the extreme parameter. Okay, so back to the compatibility screen and just scroll down just a little bit until we get to the GPU driver. Now again, there are a lot of options here as well, but for the sake of simplicity, I usually start out with the latest drivers available for a specific device. So if you're using a handheld with the 865, 8 Gen 2, or G2 Gen 2, you will want to use the latest turnip drivers available as your starting point. In this case, we will be using turnip version 26.0.0 R7. Now if you're on an 8 Elite device, you will want to use the latest 8 Elite drivers, which at this time is the Qualcomm 842.16 driver. These are our default driver options. So let's scroll down a little bit more, and now let's use the latest DXVK version, which is 2.7.1-1-async as our default. And right below that, let's use VKD 3D-2.13 as our default. Finally, for this CPU translator, we will use the latest version of FX, which at the time of this video is 2025-12-17. It should be safe to use whatever is the latest since it does get updated fairly frequently. Now, just keep these entries in mind because throughout the video, I will let you know if anything needs to be adjusted, but amazingly, most of the games in this showcase won't need many changes. So let's go ahead and launch Blur, and you will notice that it's downloading some things. That's because we've never launched a game before, and so it needs all of those files and settings that we just configured in the compatibility section. And for Blur, it basically works on the first launch. There will be cases when a game might need to be launched again to get it to work, so don't get discouraged if it doesn't work the first time. So while we are in-game, there is a side menu available for Gamehub, and you can access it in-game by either swiping in from the side of the screen or using the dedicated back button on your handheld, which will bring it up as well. Now there are a few things that can be adjusted here on the fly, but probably the most important thing for the sake of this video is the ability to enable the frame limit in case a game can't do it within its own settings. This is also useful for those that have a device that can handle 120 frames per second. The frame limit is pretty straightforward, just enable it and then set it to whatever you want. So for example here I changed it to 30 and you can see in-game that we're now capped to 30 frames per second. You can also use this menu to enable or disable the informational overlay and customize it as you wish. We also have the ability to bring up a keyboard as needed for some games. And finally, you can use this menu to exit out of a game. Okay, so it looks like my copy of Castlevania downloaded from Steam. So let's go over one quick thing when it comes to Steam versions of games. If you go to the PC game settings, we have an additional entry on this screen which is related to Steam. We have a few options, including changing the Steam client version, which can occasionally solve issues with a game failing to launch for various reasons. You can also enable the offline mode for a game in case you know you'll be without an internet connection. Gamehub does support cloud saves, and by default it will automatically sync them. Finally, you can even enable Steam input, but I personally leave it off since all the games in this showcase play nicely as is. And that's it, we've done it. So take a nice deep breath, maybe grab a few snacks from your rust bin, and let's enjoy a fun comparison of different chipsets and talk about some games with our games showcase. Now of course we're going to start this showcase out with one of my personal favorite racing games, and one that has been sadly delisted for a very long time. If you guessed Blur, then you guessed correctly. Blur is an awesome racing game with a twist, which blends over-the-top racing mechanics with power-ups and weapons, and was developed by Bizarre Creation, a studio that sadly is no longer with us and best known for their work on Project Gotham Racing. Now your eyes are not deceiving you, and this is definitely an interesting one to start out with because you gotta give it to that aging Snapdragon 865, which is very much holding its own for this game specifically. For Blur, I have the game maxed out for graphics using a 1080p resolution with the translation parameters set to extreme across the board for this footage to keep everything as close as possible. I will say that the Retroid Pocket 5 with the Snapdragon 865 did crash pretty consistently using the extreme parameters, so realistically you will not get as good performance as you are seeing here, since we are struggling a bit with stability. Of course, the Snapdragon 8 Elite does maintain the best performance overall pretty much throughout, but it's not as big of an advantage as one might think. And honestly, across the board with these settings, the game is very close in terms of performance. Blur is definitely an outlier, as we will find out soon enough, but is a good example of why there's more at play here than just raw power. For the Snapdragon 865 devices, I'd recommend turning it down to a 720p resolution and just keeping settings as low as possible to get the best performance, and the game does pretty well this way, and it's very playable here with these devices. As I mentioned, I did have some stability issues with this game using the extreme parameters, so you might need to adjust down to performance, which does impact the frame rate. Now for the Retroid Pocket G2, since we are CPU bound, the resolution really doesn't matter all too much here, and no matter what, we can't seem to hit a stable 60 frames per second. But it is very close with the footage here using 1080p and the lowest settings, which I think is very playable. Now for handhelds with the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, much like the G2, we are CPU bound here as well, and so you can just stick with that 1080p resolution using the lowest settings like the G2, which will get you closest to a stable 60 frames per second, and you can probably get away with a bit higher settings, but really it's a preference, and for this footage again I am set to 1080p and lowest settings. Finally, for the Odin 3, we obviously have the most room to adjust here, and for this one, like the G2 and 8 Gen 2, 1080p is the target resolution, and while you can definitely leave it all maxed out, I do like changing the graphics quality to the second best option since it gives us that nice and smooth 60 frames per second gameplay. You could try to target 120 frames per second, but this is a pretty demanding game despite its age, and so I like the former option the most. For the 8 Elite, make sure to use these settings on screen, as it does require that we use a specific version of DXVK, which is version 2.4.1-ASIC. Let's now check out some Castlevania Lords of Shadow, which is a fantastic 3D take on Castlevania and an absolute gem from the 360 and PlayStation 3 era. The PC version is the way to go here in terms of playing it on Android, since it does have some issues with the PlayStation 3 version using RPCSX. For this comparison test, we are targeting 1080p at the highest settings possible across the board using the extreme parameter. And we're starting to see more of an obvious separation here between the four chipsets, with the G2 Gen 2 really trading blows with the 8 Gen 2. We do see the 865 fall behind here, with both the 8 Gen 2 and G2 Gen 2 almost doubling performance in some cases. The 8 Elite really pulls ahead here, with it doubling the performance of the 8 Gen 2 and G2 Gen 2, getting us well over 60 frames per second with these maxed out settings, which is quite impressive. So based on all of that, for the Snapdragon 865, I recommend just going with a 720p resolution with the lowest settings to keep it nice and locked to that 60 frames per second target, which is very solid for any of the handhelds with this chipset, and performance is very solid this way. On the Retroid Pocket G2, we can definitely turn things up a bit here, and you have some flexibility in terms of how you can set your graphic options, and you can either prioritize performance and resolution by going with a 1080p resolution, but then using the lowest graphic options to keep it locked or close to 60 frames per second, or you can enjoy the beautiful visuals turned up, but then go with a 720p resolution to still maintain that 60 frames per second target. But either way, this is absolutely gorgeous here. And the same can be said for any device with a Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, which we have the same flexibility with, and again can either opt for a 1080p resolution but with the graphical options turned down, or go with a 720p resolution with the best graphics. And finally, for the 8 Elite, we can stay locked to that 1080p resolution and keep all the settings turned up without much issue here, and honestly, we can go well above the 60 frames per second cap if you desire. But just keep in mind that in order to hit 120 frames per second, you will need to turn down the graphical fidelity and possibly even the resolution. For this game, we need to use a specific version of DXVK, which is version 1.10.3. Now the best part about this game is that it does run very well for all 4 chipsets. And so this is a game that can be enjoyed on a very wide variety of handhelds, which at the end of the day is something that I love to see. It's truly amazing how many awesome games have been delisted over the years, and Deadpool is another one you could add to the list, and a game that is well worth playing through. Deadpool comes to us from High Moon Studios, and it goes without saying that this studio was, as the young kids say, cooking with some licensed properties around this time, releasing gems like Deadpool as well as Transformers War for Cybertron and Fall of Cybertron. Deadpool is another good showcase of some of that performance uplift we see coming from the now aging Snapdragon 865, at least when it comes to really pushing these settings here. And of course across the board, we have Deadpool at a 1080p resolution making use of the extra settings, which is the highest graphical option. In many cases, both the G2 Gen 2 and 8 Gen 2 see nearly double the performance here, and unsurprisingly, the 8 Elite has essentially flatlined at that 60 frames per second target, which is pretty impressive since that extra graphic option can be quite demanding. The good news is that just like Castlevania, Deadpool is a game that does well across all sorts of handhelds and chipsets, and so let's talk about the 865 first, which for this I have set to a 720p resolution instead, using low settings, and you can see that while we may not be at 60 frames per second consistently in heavier scenes, we are definitely at a very playable frame rate, and so handhelds with the 865 will still fare very well. For both the G2 Gen 2 and the 8 Gen 2, we have a bit more room to adjust here, but I did have some issues with stability for both of these chipsets, and so the extreme parameter is problematic, but you can adjust the performance and it should be good. Regardless, with the 2 chipsets, you can either go for a lower resolution like 720p and turn up the graphical fidelity, or use 1080p but just turn down the graphic settings to low and you should be good to go. Finally, for the Odin 3 and really any device with an 8 Elite, you can enjoy the high settings at 1080p, which really stays at 60 frames per second locked and performs very nicely here with the 8 Elite. Deadpool does need very specific settings, which I have on screen here for your use, and that should be pretty solid for gameplay with the 8 Elite. But what do you know, we've got yet another game that has long been since delisted. Driver San Francisco was sadly the last time we'd get a new entry in the Driver franchise dating way back to 2011. And it's a huge bummer, since Driver San Francisco really put the series back on the right track, having you play as John Tanner yet again, with the biggest feature being the ability to shift, allowing you to teleport from one car to another, which actually drew its inspiration from Google Earth. I believe this is one of the oldest PC games I will be featuring for this showcase, and across the board here we can see that all the chipsets are doing quite well despite that 1080p target with high settings and the 60 frames per second cap. Unsurprisingly, the 865 does lag behind, but I think it is interesting to see the G2 Gen 2 struggle a little bit more than the 8 Gen 2, which does seem to handle this game a bit better with these specific settings. Of course, it's not much of a surprise that the 8 Elite is doing very well here. This game does not seem to be as GPU heavy, and so I think that is part of the struggle with the G2 Gen 2 with its slightly weaker CPU compared to the 8 Gen 2. So for the 865, I recommend dropping settings across the board if you're wanting to target as stable of a 60 frames per second experience as possible. And for this footage, I am set to a 720p resolution with low settings, which for the most part does keep us at that specific target. But regardless, this is a very solid performer on the 865. Now for the G2 Gen 2, even though we saw it does not perform as strong as the 8 Gen 2, you can honestly get away with 1080p high settings if you'd like. But given that it performs this well at these settings, we basically have a lot of room to adjust settings as needed, and you can always tweak it a bit to help stabilize that frame rate. The 8 Gen 2 is an excellent performer with this game, so not much needs to be said here, but we can probably get away with an uncapped frame rate to go above the 60 frames per second cap. But if you're wanting to target 120 frames per second, it's surprisingly quite demanding despite the age of the game, and so you will need to turn the settings down a bit to get as close as possible to that target, which does mean that the 8 Elite is the best shot in terms of going above 60 frames per second for this game, if that is your goal. but is also an excellent performer at 1080p high settings. I think it goes without saying that this is another game that can be enjoyed on a variety of handhelds, which is never a bad thing. We've covered some older PC games up to this point, so it's now time to really scale up and check out Final Fantasy VII Remake, which is definitely going to be much more demanding than what we've seen so far in terms of requirements, and should be a fun comparison round. I don't think this game needs much of an introduction here and is an awesome modern remake of the beloved Final Fantasy VII. Now, given that this is a bit more demanding, for this comparison round I am trying to keep settings the same across the board, and so for this we have every device running the game with a target of 720p using those settings, and it's very important that you set the DirectX11 parameter under the game settings in general, and then in the command line field put -DX11, which will trigger the game to launch in the DirectX11 mode. Unfortunately, the poor Snapdragon 865 is really trying its best to keep up with this game, with the G2 Gen 2 and 8 Gen 2 showing very similar performance again, with just a slight advantage to the 8 Gen 2, and finally the 8 Elite, which pretty much doubles the performance of the 8 Gen 2 and at times can even hit above 60 frames per second depending on the scene, which is very impressive and something the other chipsets cannot accomplish. Now, I don't personally recommend playing Final Fantasy VII on any of the 865 devices, since this is just under what I consider a playable frame rate even with the lowest settings and 720p resolution. There might be some potato mode tweaks you can make, but honestly, forget about it. Let's focus on the G2 Gen 2 instead, and again, with the 720p low settings, we are just right at that playable frame rate, hovering around 30 frames per second. And so this is definitely a game that can run on the Retroid Pocket G2, and you can always cap 30 frames per second if you want to lock down that frame rate. The same goes for the 8 Gen 2, which does better on its highs, getting as much as 50 frames per second at times, but again, we are using the same 720p low settings, and you can always cap the frame rate for a more stable experience if you'd like. Now, for the 8 Elite, the performance is definitely a lot better, but unfortunately the game is quite unstable using the DirectX 11 version with this chipset, and I did experience a good amount of instability with the game locking up on me quite frequently. So I do recommend going with the DirectX 12 version, which is simple enough to do. In the game settings, under General, just make sure that there is no entry in the command line field. I do recommend going with some slightly different settings, which I actually have on screen here, and it should address the crashing. There are unfortunately some minor graphical artifacts at the 720p resolution, but less noticeable at 1080p. Go figure. But this does impact performance, so it's best to just lock this at 1080p, 30 frames per second, and it's pretty solid. Let's continue on with some newer and more demanding games that can really push these handhelds and the potential of Gamehub. Grid 2019 is another entry in the long-running racing game series by Codemasters, and surprisingly, this was very quietly delisted back in 2023, and so it's yet another game that cannot be purchased on the Steam storefront. Grid is a great showcase of the need for newer and more powerful chipsets, as it's not much of a surprise that the aging Snapdragon 865 is really struggling with this game. I think there's only one other game that performs as badly as this, which we will feature later in the showcase. But honestly, it's remarkable that it could even run here. This also demonstrates the widespread compatibility that we are now seeing with Gamehub. The G2 Gen 2 and 8 Gen 2 are pretty much neck and neck with this game, offering as much as 3 times the in-game performance as the 865. And unsurprisingly, the 8 Elite pulls ahead with a sizable performance improvement over the G2 Gen 2 and 8 Gen 2, and very much so over the 865. The 8 Elite does have very minor graphical artifacting in the skyline, but it doesn't really impact gameplay at all. Now, just as a quick note, for this comparison, the game is set to a 1280 by 720 resolution, with the ultra low settings, and so this is a very demanding game to run. For the 865, unfortunately I tried to run the game at a lower resolution such as 960 by 544, but it just causes the game to crash, and so outside of messing around with some settings, this is just a game that is realistically not going to happen here on a handheld with the 865. The Retroid Pocket G2 definitely fares better thanks to its G2 Gen 2 chip, but once you get into some various tracks that have more demanding effects, it starts to become obvious that this one can struggle a bit at times. And so while it's very close to being at least playable at 30 frames per second using 720p ultra low, it's just not quite there. Now, the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 is aging like a bottle of fine wine and runs quite well over 30 frames per second mostly. It's definitely pushing the device hard with almost full CPU and GPU utilization at 720p with ultra low setting. You can easily cap this one to 30 frames per second to stabilize the frame rate, and I'd say it's a bit more playable than what we saw with the G2 Gen 2, and the small performance boost definitely helps this game out quite a bit. Finally, the 8 Elite gives us a little more room to breathe with this very demanding game, and we have a few ways we can go about this. The game never quite hits a stable 60 frames per second, but at least on 720p ultra low, it's kind of in this weird place where it just hangs out in the 50s. So you can go about it in different ways, much like some other games in this showcase. For the footage here, I am set to use 1080p with low settings, so we do get a bump up in resolution and graphical settings from the comparison footage, and I think for this game, it's a good place. We still do have the graphical artifacting in the skyline, but again, it doesn't really impact gameplay. Inazuma 11 Victory Road is the newest game I'll be featuring here in the showcase, releasing just last month, and it's the latest entry in the Inazuma 11 franchise from level 5. I've always really enjoyed the Inazuma 11 games, which are basically football-themed RPGs that have gone on to become a massive media property, covering not only video game entries, but manga, television, and movies. I was pretty hopeful that this newest game, Victory Road, would fare well not only with Gamehub, but also across a variety of devices, and it looks like my hunch was a good one. For this comparison, I am using a 1080p resolution with low settings, and at this point I think we kinda know how everything's gonna play out here. With the 865 performing the worst, the G2 Gen 2 performing slightly worse than the 8 Gen 2, and of course the 8 Elite showing off its muscle. The good news is that unlike what we saw with Grid 2019, Inazuma 11 is quite playable on handhelds with the 865 as long as you turn down settings, and with this footage we are set to a 720p resolution using low settings. No matter what we do here, we won't be hitting 60 frames per second on here, so it's best to just cap at 30 frames per second if you want to stabilize the frame rate and keep things nice and smooth. The G2 is struggling with this game since it seems to be very CPU dependent and so doesn't fare as well as the 8 Gen 2. Therefore, we don't have enough power on hand here to hit that same 60 frames per second target, and much like the 865, we do need to rely on the lowest settings possible for the best performance, which gets us closer to 60 frames per second, but not quite there. But at least it is an improvement over the 865. The 8 Gen 2 fares very well with the same 720p and low settings and allows us to basically hit 60 frames per second solid, which is very awesome to see on an older chipset and a new release game, and while it might not be the most demanding game visually, it's still neat that this game works as well as it does. Finally, for the 8 Elite, we saw in the comparison footage that it was hitting well above 60 frames per second, and so we have a lot of room to wiggle here with this chipset. For this specific footage, I am set to a 1080p resolution using low settings, and we are locked as stable as possible to that 60 frames per second frame rate, since it can't quite hit 120 frames per second with 1080p low, but it's still nice to get the resolution bump and the incredibly stable frame rate. The game can actually manage almost a full 60 frames per second using medium setting, and again it just demonstrates the overhead we have here with the 8 Elite. Tomb Raider 2013 makes a return to the channel as one of the longest running games that I've featured in terms of Gamehub and Winlator on Android, and it's really been such a stable and highly compatible game across all kinds of devices. As such, Tomb Raider 2013 is a great benchmark game for that reason, and it's a good way to demonstrate again the type of power we have on hand across all the various chipsets. For this footage, we are targeting 1080p with high settings, and again we see a very similar scale in terms of performance from the 865 to the middle ground with the G2 Gen 2 and 8 Gen 2, and of course the 8 Elite with the strongest numbers. The G2 Gen 2 and 8 Gen 2 have yet again very similar numbers, which at this point we can see that the G2 Gen 2 is quite a solid performer, and the 8 Gen 2 is clearly aging very well. The 8 Elite comes out ahead with numbers well above 60 frames per second, which is absolutely insane for a game on this level at these settings. So let's talk about ideal settings for the 865 devices, which probably based on some of the prior games we kinda know where we're gonna end up here. Ideally, you're going to want to target a resolution of 720p with low settings, and this will get you close to or at that 60 frames per second target, which given the age of this chipset is very impressive, and I'm surprised it's holding on here. I will say the game did crash on me once during testing, so take that for what you will. Now with both the G2 Gen 2 and 8 Gen 2, we can turn the resolution up to 1080p but stick with the same low settings, and we can get that 60 frames per second with both the G2 and the 8 Gen 2. The 8 Gen 2 might have a little more flexibility with its settings, and it might even be able to go up to the normal settings, still hitting 60 frames per second. Finally, for the 8 Elite, we can very easily keep the 1080p resolution with normal settings as the baseline here, and we are well above 60 frames per second. But for this specific footage, I am hard capped at 60 to keep things nice and steady. We have the most room to adjust here, and can probably even get away with high settings or turn things down to hit a 120 frames per second target, which I've actually done in the past and have showcased on the channel in the past. I've got one more delisted game that I absolutely love to feature anytime I can on the channel. Transformers Devastation is a gem of a game that comes to us from Platinum Games. It turns out that when you give a studio like Platinum a beloved license such as the Transformers, you end up with a pretty memorable product. The visual style and gameplay makes this one a very easy recommend if you're a fan of either the Transformers, which it's very faithful to, and Platinum Games as a studio. This is probably the strangest out of all the comparisons and results, and despite the age of the game, which was released back in 2015, this one really gets very demanding for these chipsets when we try to target that 1080p resolution with the highest settings possible. Amazingly, across the board, none of the chipsets can really get up there in terms of frame rate, but I think what's most surprising is that the 8 Elite is not much ahead of the G2 Gen 2 or 8 Gen 2. And you gotta give the 865 some credit for even hanging on here for this demanding test. The Snapdragon 865 is a very solid performer with this game, and if you want to hit 60 frames per second, I do recommend changing the resolution to 720p and sticking with low, which will mostly get you there. Surprisingly, this game fares decently with 1080p as a resolution option, but in general, I just recommend going with 720p low, since the game does look great even with these settings. Now for the Retroid Pocket G2, we can get away with that 1080p resolution using low settings, and we're pretty much locked to 60 frames per second, and likewise for the Odin 2, which also does well with the same settings. Now I mentioned earlier that the 8 Elite isn't such a strong performer with this game, and so just like the G2 Gen 2, 8 Gen, and 8 Gen 2, we're going to stick with the 1080p and low settings option, which is very nice and smooth, hitting a rock solid 60 frames per second. For this game, we do need to use a very specific driver, which is the 842.8 Qualcomm driver instead of the latest one, since we do get issues with the graphics. Finally, we've reached the last game in this showcase, and we've got another fairly new release. Yakuza Like a Dragon released back in 2020, and so it's not the newest game here, which still belongs to Inazuma 11, but I think we've covered a good range of games. Like a Dragon is a bit of a departure from the usual Yakuza games, as it's a turn-based RPG, but also introduces a new protagonist. Like a Dragon, unsurprisingly, is a very demanding game, and for these comparisons, the game is set to use a 720p resolution with the lowest settings, and much like what we saw with Grid 2019, this one is not a great performer honestly across the board, with the 865 absolutely being destroyed here, seeing half the frame rate of its newer counterparts in the G2 Gen 2 and 8 Gen 2. Now things get a little interesting here with the 8 Elite, since while we do see it flex its muscles at times, the performance is very inconsistent, and it does have this weird slowdown that is quite noticeable in-game, despite what the frame counter might be showing. For the 865, I didn't quite give up on it, and I went back and tried a lower resolution like 800 by 600, since the game wouldn't support 960 by 544. But even at 800 by 600 with a 50% render scale, you can see that performance is still not quite there, and honestly the game just looks absolutely terrible this way, so for the 865, you can forget about it. The Retroid Pocket G2 definitely fares a lot better here than my Retroid Pocket 5, and like our comparison settings, I am using 720p with the lowest settings, and while it's not amazing, it is closer to being an actual playable experience. The 8 Gen 2 honestly might actually be the best out of the bunch, including the 8 Elite, since the performance, while nothing amazing, is pretty steady and we don't get any of the weird slowdown issues present in the 8 Elite, but we have just enough extra power over the G2 Gen 2 that makes this a fairly playable experience at the same 720p with lowest settings, and this one can probably just be capped to 30 frames per second. Sadly, I tried a few combinations on my Odin 3 with the 8 Elite, and the weird slowdown issue makes this one not the most enjoyable experience despite the frame rate that can get pretty high up there, which is a shame. So we've reached the end of this showcase, and I think it's safe to say that devices with the Snapdragon 865 can still do quite a bit, and out of the 10 games featured here, only 2 of them are really not playable with devices like the Retroid Pocket 5 that I have featured here. And that's quite impressive, so for those that are still enjoying their handhelds with the 865, there's still plenty to enjoy here, as long as you don't mind turning down the resolution or settings. And honestly, the 720p resolution looks great on these smaller devices, so it's not a huge loss. This also bodes well for those that are considering the upcoming MainMe Pocket Max, which will have that same Snapdragon 865 in it. Now the Retroid Pocket G2 definitely provides a nice bump in terms of performance, which lets us either get away with higher resolutions or settings, as well as helping close the gap to make those two games that weren't playable on the 865 at least more playable here. Regardless, there's a tremendous amount of power here for the price of the device, and for those new to the space, this is a great price to performance option, but maybe not as compelling for someone to upgrade from the Retroid Pocket 5 unless you really enjoy the form factor. Now the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 just continues to age like a fine wine and proves to be a very strong option here, with some games really benefiting from that small advantage over the G2 Gen 2 chipset, which makes this still one of the best chipsets in handhelds like the Odin 2 lineup, as well as the upcoming Retroid Pocket 6. Finally, the 8 Elite has done quite well here as well, with all 10 games able to launch and run, so despite some worries about compatibility, it is doing well with the selection of these games here. We only saw one case where the chipset didn't provide a huge uplift in performance with Transformers, and then this sort of weird performance with Yakuza, but all in all, a very nice boost in performance, and I think we're going to continue to see things get better for it. Now, regardless of what device you use, I hope this video inspires you to give PC gaming on these handhelds a shot, since it might just surprise you, and at least with these 10 games featured, maybe a good starting off point. I know this will not be the last time I talk about this topic, but until then, as always, I am the Retro Tech Dad, and thank you so much for watching.